Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to give you that shortcut to being well-informed, taking on some pretty dense material, and pulling out the core ideas and, well, the context you need. Today, we're diving into something really fundamental. It's this age-old tension in philosophy. The clash between that sudden flash of insight, that feeling of unity, what we often call mysticism, and on the other hand, the slow, careful, step-by-step demand for proof and logic, the scientific way of thinking. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. We've got some incredibly rich sources here looking at how these two, well, impulses, mysticism and logic, have really shaped how humans have tried to grasp the world as a whole. Our mission today is basically to walk you through this whole philosophical journey from, the ancient Greeks right up to some, frankly, revolutionary stuff in modern math and logic, all to get a handle on what a reliable path for philosophy might actually look like.
Yeah, and connecting that to the bigger picture. This isn't just about looking back at history, is it? There's a real argument being made here. The idea is that the search for truth, like real truth, ultimately needs this rigorous scientific kind of mindset. The goal is to figure out a philosophical method, really, that can maybe use that spark, the creative insight from mysticism. But only, and this is key, only after you've put it through the ringer of ruthless, impartial intellectual honesty, the kind science demands.
Right from the start, it seems philosophy has always been driven by these two forces kind of pulling together, but maybe more often pulling against each other.
Exactly. And the sources make a really interesting point about philosophical greatness here. You can find brilliant thinkers who lean almost entirely one way. So you've got someone like Hume, super empirical, all about observation. Or, flip side, Blake, purely visionary mystical poetry. But the really towering figures, the ones who define eras, they seem to feel the pull of both. They need that unifying vision, but they also need the solid structure. They're wrestling with that tension.
And Heraclitus seems like a perfect example of someone right in the middle of that wrestle. He's famous for flux, obviously. Everything's always changing.
And that idea, it didn't just pop into his head. It was grounded in what he saw. He was quite scientific for his time. He actually said, the things that can be seen, heard, and learned are what I prize the most. He was an observer. And observing carefully led him to some pretty radical conclusions, stuff that went against common sense, like the sun is new every day. That points to constant universal change. And he tried to find something permanent underneath it all, right? Settling on fire as this ever-changing yet fundamental substance. It was an attempt at a scientific explanation, really.
But then almost immediately, that scientific observation sparks something deeper, more mystical, that famous poetic style. He wasn't just listing facts.
That's the crucial part, the intimate blending. He starts insisting on the identity of opposites. Good and ill are one. He sees unity in the contradiction. Plato later summarized his famous river saying as, you cannot step twice into the same rivers, which is the scientific takeaway, the flux. But Heraclitus' own words are more paradoxical, more mystical. We step and do not step into the same rivers. We are and are not. It ties us, the observer, into the flow. And his metaphors, like time being a child playing drafts, it's that sudden unifying insight mixed right in with the observation. That mix gives his work its lasting power.
Okay, but that balance seems to shift quite dramatically when we get to Plato. With him, the mystical side, that search for a perfect, timeless reality really seems to take over.
Oh, definitely. The allegory of the cave is just. It's the ultimate statement of belief in a reality beyond our senses, isn't it? The world we see. Just shadows. The real stuff is the forms. And that whole journey of the prisoner coming out, adjusting to the light, it all leads up to contemplating the form of good. And for Plato, that's the ultimate source of everything, truth, reason, reality itself.
And right there, identifying the ultimate reality with the ultimate good, that's where our sources say philosophy took a wrong turn. It created this divorce between philosophy and science. Why is putting good at the top so problematic for finding objective truth?
Well, it basically injects desire right into the heart of your method for discovering what's real. If what you want the universe to be, your ethical hopes, start dictating what reality must be, then you've abandoned that core requirement for intellectual honesty. Science says you report the facts, whether they make you happy or sad.
Right.
But once you start assuming the universe is built to satisfy our ideas of morality, you're not observing anymore, you're projecting. You've basically swapped the hard work of finding truth for building, well, pleasing dreams, as the source puts it.
So the idea is ethical thinking should come after you've figured out what's true. It helps you decide your attitude towards the truth, but it shouldn't dictate what the truth gets to be in the first place.
Precisely. And ironically, you actually see a little glimpse of that scientific spirit in Plato's own dialogues. There's that bit where Parmenides tells the young Socrates, basically, don't look down on the grubby stuff. Hair, mud, dirt. That advice really captures the impartial spirit science needs. Just accept the facts, even the messy or unpleasant ones, without judgment. But unfortunately, that spirit kind of got overshadowed in Plato by the focus on those perfect, transcendent forms, all centered around the good.
And this whole focus on an unchanging, unified, perfect reality, that links straight back to Parmenides himself, doesn't it? His whole logical mysticism thing.
Oh, hugely influential. Parmenides was incredibly strict with his logic. He argued reality, what he called being, had to be uncreated, indestructible, unchanging, indivisible.
Why? What was the logic there?
His core principle is basically you can't know what is not, or even think about it. If you can think or talk about something, it is. So since we can think about the past must be real, right now, which means change, creation, destruction. They all have to be illusions because they imply something that has somehow become something that is not. And that drive towards absolute unity, denying all division and change, well, that shapes a whole strand of metaphysics, from Plato right up to Hegel and other monists later on. They all wrestle with how to fit the messy, changing world we actually live in into that unified picture.
Okay, so if we try to boil down the key features of this mystical impulse across history, our sources seem to highlight two main things.
Yeah, the first one is this deep belief in insight over analysis. It's the idea that there's a kind of way of wisdom that's sudden, direct, totally convincing.
Yeah.
Completely different from the slow, painstaking, error-prone process of learning through senses and logic. And often there's this initial negative phase, too, of feeling that everyday objects aren't quite real, which sort of clears the decks for this higher wisdom to rush in.
And the second feature, coming straight from Parmenides really, is that absolute belief in unity, a refusal to accept that things are truly separate or opposed, like Heraclitus saying, the way up and the way down is one.
And in more modern philosophy, you see this championed by Henry Bergson. He really elevated instinct, calling it philosophical intuition.
Right. Bertrand said there are two basic ways of knowing things. There's the intellect, which kind of circles around an object, getting only relative bits and pieces. But then there's intuition, which he called an intellectual sympathy. It lets you enter into the thing, get its absolute nature from the inside. He thought self-knowledge, that direct feeling of our own consciousness flowing, was the prime example.
But this is exactly where the scientific pushback comes in really strongly. That feeling of insight, no matter how powerful it feels subjectively, just isn't enough on its own to guarantee truth. This is super important for telling solid philosophy, apart from just, well, feeling strongly about something.
Why is that subjective certainty seen as a weakness, not a strength?
Because, frankly, feeling certain doesn't correlate very well with actually being right. I mean, self-knowledge. It's notoriously difficult. History's full of people who are profoundly wrong about themselves. And think about insight in love. How often does that turn out to be an illusion, leading to huge mistakes?
Yeah.
The sources argue that intuition is really just a very developed, specialized kind of instinct. It feels so compelling because it's deep-seated, immediate.
And the big problem with relying purely on instinct is
Instinct works brilliantly in familiar situations, the ones it evolved for. But it's totally incompetent, as the source says, when things change, or when you try to apply to something completely new or abstract. The analogy used is great. The mother hen with ducklings. Her maternal instinct, that deep connection, is wonderful. Until the ducklings hit the water. Suddenly, her powerful intuition is useless. She's stuck on the bank, totally helpless, watching them do something her instinct just can't compute.
That's a really vivid picture of philosophical failure, isn't it? Trying to understand the whole universe using tools designed for, basic survival seems,
well, inadequate.
Totally inadequate. Philosophy isn't about tapping into our animal instincts. It's described as a highly refined, highly civilized pursuit. It demands we step back from those immediate pressures. So insight might provide the creative spark, the initial idea, but reason is the harmonizing, controlling force. It has to rigorously check and constrain that instinct, that spark. Which leads us straight to what serious scientific philosophy requires at its core. It needs this impersonal disinterestedness, this freedom from practical worries. It demands this big, sweeping view of the universe that relies on scientific restraint and balance, not just confidently asserting whatever intuition pops into your head.
Okay, so this leads us to a really crucial and maybe controversial point that comes out of this scientific approach to philosophy. What's fascinating is the claim that actually removing ethical concerns and human desires from the process of philosophical inquiry is, in itself, an ethical step forward.
Whoa, hang on, that sounds completely paradoxical. How can being neutral about good and evil possibly lead to better outcomes?
Well, look at the history of science itself. Physics, biology, they only really took off when they stopped trying to prove how ethically important their findings were. Astronomers gave up astrology when they realized the stars didn't care about human destiny. And it was precisely that objective knowledge, that success, that eventually led to real benefits, navigation, medicine, things far beyond the vague ethical claims they left behind.
Okay, so the argument is, until we can manage to think about the universe in ethically neutral terms, setting aside our hopes, fears, loves, hates, philosophy, we'll just keep producing comforting illusions, these pleasing dreams.
Exactly. The paradox is deep. The people who temporarily forget about good and evil just to focus on the facts are actually more likely to achieve real good in the world later on, compared to those who start with strong convictions about how things ought to be. The only good that's really our business is the good we can create in our own lives and societies, not trying to force our human values onto the vast, indifferent universe.
And this need for disinterestedness ties into the critique of time as well, doesn't it? We mentioned earlier that the idea of time being unreal often comes from mystical insight, that feeling of an eternal now, like that Sufi poet saying past and future veil God, burn them up.
Yes, and the scientific philosophical view also demands we recognize the unimportance of time when it comes to truth itself. The difference we feel so strongly that we can change the future but not the past is purely practical. It's about where we can exert our will, our desires. But if you step back and contemplate impartially, that practical difference just disappears. Past and future are equally real parts of the objective picture. Reaching the true gate of wisdom means learning to see the whole timeline in one go, objectively. So this is a pretty sharp criticism of philosophies built around the idea of progress, then. Absolutely. Things like Bergson's vialism, Nietzsche's will to power, pragmatism, they're all critiqued here because they hinge on progress, on change being inherently from worse to better. And by doing that, they let time become their tyrant. They're always too busy chasing some future goal. They lack that aloof, arduous discipline that scientific philosophy requires, that quiet, objective contemplation of reality as it is, not as we wish it were becoming.
This demand for objectivity also means rejecting that traditional philosophical goal of monism, the idea of a single, unified universe as a whole.
That's right. Traditional monism often seems driven by an emotional need for unity. It demands reality fit our desire for coherence. And that often puts it at odds with science and common sense, which show us a world made up of lots of distinct facts.
So the alternative proposed is logical atomism or absolute pluralism. How does that work exactly?
Logical atomism basically says philosophy has to be done piece by piece. You deal with problems distributively, one at a time, not collectively. The core idea is that there aren't really any meaningful statements you can make about the universe as a single subject. We don't talk about properties of the whole totality. We talk about properties of individual things or relationships between things. The universe isn't one thing. It's just the collection of all the separate facts.
So we can't legitimately say the universe is good or the universe is evolving. Only things like this specific event seems good or this particular process involves change.
Exactly. And that leads to thinking about what philosophical statements are. Since philosophy aims for the highest generality, philosophical propositions have to be general and a priori, meaning they're true independent of any specific accidental facts we discover through our senses. They'd be true in any possible world because they're about the structure of logic itself. Philosophy, in this view, becomes the science of the possible. Can you give a quick example of an a priori proposition, just to make that clear?
Sure. A scientific finding like water boils at 100 Celsius at sea level is a posteriori. It's true because of specific facts about our world. An a priori proposition might be something like if P implies Q and Q implies R, then P implies R. That's true no matter what P, Q, and R are, water, planets, numbers, whatever. It's about the structure of valid reasoning. That's the realm of pure philosophy. Okay, so when we look for the discipline that really embodies this a priori scientific structure most purely, we land on mathematics. The sources get almost poetic about it, calling math supreme beauty, a beauty cold and austere like that of sculpture. It's presented as this ultimate haven for pure thought, free from messy compromises and, well, the harsh realities of the world.
And the huge breakthrough in the 19th and early 20th centuries was realizing that mathematics and logic are essentially the same thing. George Boole kicked this off with his loss of thought. It showed math isn't just about quantity. It's really just the more advanced part of pure logic.
Right, and this is where we get that really interesting, maybe slightly baffling definition. Mathematics may be defined as the subject in which we never know what we are talking about, nor whether what we're saying is true. That
Yeah.
sounds odd.
It sounds odd, but it perfectly captures that formal purity. Math doesn't care about what things are in the real world. It's all about logical structure. We never know what we're talking about because the symbols are just variables. You could swap numbers for sets or points, and the logical relationships hold. And we never know whether what we are saying is true because mathematical truth is always conditional. It's always, if you accept these axioms, which are just starting assumptions, then this theorem logically follows.
So mathematical truth is about structure, not facts about the world, and getting that structure right requires incredible rigor. Symbolism becomes really important here.
Absolutely essential, and maybe counterintuitively, rigorous symbols actually make things difficult, which is good. Concepts like 1 or 2 feel so obvious it's hard to see the real basic assumptions underneath. Using strict symbols forces you to dig down and find what's truly fundamental, what you can't define any further. It turns out, all of arithmetic rests on only about a dozen truly basic ideas, like zero, number, and the concept of next after.
And we need proof, because our common sense, that feeling of self-evidence, can be really misleading with abstract stuff.
Exactly. The classic example is that common sense axiom. A whole always has more terms than a part. Seems obvious for, say, apples in a basket. But it's completely false for infinite collections. Think about all the even numbers that's clearly only part of all the whole numbers. Yet, modern set theory proved rigorously that there are exactly the same number of even numbers as whole numbers. Both are infinite, but the same size of infinity. Proof is valuable because it forces us to doubt things we thought were certain. It makes us check our biases.
And this kind of precision allowed logic to finally solve Zeno's paradoxes, which had baffled philosophers for 2,000 years. Achilles and the tortoise, the arrow paradox.
Yet, for centuries, they were seen as these clever tricks showing space, time, and motion were somehow contradictory. But the work of mathematicians like Weierstrass, Dedekind, and Cantor just dismantled them using modern logic. They basically tackle the problems of continuity, infinity, and the infinitesimal, that idea of a tiny distance bigger than zero but smaller than anything measurable. Turns out, the infinitesimal wasn't needed at all. It was actually inconsistent.
So how does ditching the infinitesimal solve the arrow paradox? The idea that an arrow in flight is always motionless at the instant it occupies.
Well, the surprising thing is Zeno was basically right about that. Modern logic agrees. Motion isn't some weird state of being in between places within an instant. Motion simply means being at one point at one time and a different point at a slightly later time. The path is made of points. And at any single point in time, the arrow is stationary, exactly where it is. Zeno's paradox becomes just an accurate description of motion in a continuous series.
Okay, what about Achilles and the tortoise? Why doesn't the infinite series of smaller gaps mean Achilles never catches up?
That paradox relied on applying that faulty whole is greater than the part idea to infinite sets. Yes, the number of points Achilles has to cross is infinite, but they get infinitely close together, and he covers them in a finite time. The crucial insight from Cantor was showing that an infinite set, like the points Achilles crosses, can have the same number of members as one of its own parts, like the points the tortoise crosses. Once you accept that, the logical reason Achilles must fail just evaporates. The power of formal logic cleaned up centuries of confusion.
Okay, so we've seen this intense logical rigor applied to pure math and infinity. Now, the sources argue we need to turn that same uncompromising honesty onto the physical world itself. And the first thing that needs to go, apparently, is the whole concept of cause.
That's the argument. The word cause should basically be kicked out of philosophy. The sources call the law of causality a relic of a bygone age, suggesting it's often tied to almost anthropomorphic thinking, linking causes to human will, like something making something else happen.
And I guess the justification is that in the really advanced sciences, like physics, they just don't use the word cause anymore.
Exactly. You look at something like gravitational astronomy. The word cause never appears. Science doesn't really talk about A is always followed by B anymore. It talks about functional relations, usually expressed as differential equations. The consistency, the lawfulness, isn't about the same cause always producing the same effect. It's about the sameness of relations between different variables over time.
Can you unpack that difference a bit more? Causation versus functional relation.
Sure. In the old causal view, you think of the past event, A, as actively forcing the future event, B. But in the functional view, like Newton's laws of motion, you just have equations relating variables like position, velocity, and time. If you know the state of a system now, the equations let you calculate its state at any other time, past or future. The future determines the past in exactly the same mathematical sense that the past determines the future. Determine here just means it is mathematically calculable from. It doesn't imply any pushing or pulling, just a functional relationship.
Okay, and if we get rid of that idea of compulsion, of one thing forcing another, that must change how we think about free will versus determinism, right?
It suggests the conflict is largely an illusion, yeah. When people worry that determinism cancels free will, they're usually reacting against the idea of being compelled, of their desires being blocked or overridden. We feel free when our actions align with our desires, when we're not being forced. But that psychological feeling of compulsion is totally different from the objective, mathematical laws describing how particles move. The universe just runs on these functional relations. Compulsion isn't really part of the physical picture.
So if we ditch cause, and we've already questioned linear time, what does this scientific philosophy actually say the world is made of? What are the ultimate constituents?
Well, it demands we reject another big assumption, the simple mind-matter split, and the idea that physical things must be permanent. What we directly experience are sense data, the patch of color, the sound, the feeling of touch right now, that stuff is considered physical and outside our minds. But, and this is crucial, it's probably not persistent. That patch of red you see likely doesn't hang around when you close your eyes.
Okay, so what about the persistent particles, the atoms and electrons we learn about, the basic building blocks?
According to this view, they aren't fundamental blocks. They are logical constructions. They're like symbolic tools, useful fictions, that help us organize and predict the patterns in those fleeting sense data. Matter should be thought of more like notes in a symphony. It's an organized collection of momentary particulars. We need to think about time corpuscles as much as space corpuscles. A physical object isn't a solid, enduring thing. It's more like the structured sequence of all its momentary appearances.
But hang on, that brings up the old problem. If I look at a table from one angle, it's rectangular. From another, it's diamond-shaped. How can one thing have incompatible shapes if matter is real?
But the incompatibility disappears if we drop a hidden assumption. The key insight is that each observer exists in their own private space. The rectangular shape you see is in your space. The diamond shape I see is in my space. The contradiction only arises if you assume both shapes must exist simultaneously in one single, shared, public space. But that public, objective space of physics where the table has its real fixed shape, that's actually a later logical construction, built by correlating and finding mathematical relationships between all our different private viewpoints.
Okay, this feels like it leads directly to that core principle mentioned.
Yeah.
Supreme maxim of scientific philosophizing. Wherever possible, logical constructions are to be substituted for inferred entities.
That's the engine driving this whole analytical approach. Instead of just assuming there's some mysterious, unobservable thing out there, like the table itself or a cardinal number, to explain our experiences, you try to replace that inferred thing with a structure built out of things you can observe or logically define. So instead of inferring a mysterious entity called the number 3, you define 3 as the class of all possible collections that have 3 members, 3 apples, 3 sounds, 3 thoughts. You replace the inferred number with the constructed class. It's about intellectual honesty. Stick to what you can construct from experience and logic.
And making this construction method work rigorously means being really clear about how we know things. The sources make a key distinction between two types of knowledge.
Yes, fundamental distinction. First, there's knowledge by acquaintance. This is direct, immediate awareness. We're acquainted with our own sense data, this patch of green, that sound, maybe with universals like redness or before, and possibly, arguably, with our own self. The idea is the ultimate building blocks of any meaningful statement we make must be things we are, or could be, acquainted with.
And contrasted with that is knowledge by description. This is how we know about things we've never directly encountered.
Exactly. Knowledge of the so-and-so. We know things about, say, the first person to climb Everest, or the center of the Milky Way, or even physical objects in other people's minds, without being directly acquainted with them. We know that such a thing exists and fits a certain description. And the really crucial philosophical move here is how you analyze those descriptive phrases themselves.
Why is analyzing descriptions so important for maintaining rigor?
Because otherwise, you risk smuggling in assumptions about existence. Traditional philosophy got tangled up with phrases like the present king of France or the author of Waverley. If you treat the author of Waverley as just a name for Scott, then Scott seems to become part of the meaning of sentences about him. The modern analysis, pioneered by Russell, shows that descriptive phrases need to be analyzed away. They get broken down into statements involving variables and existence claims, what's called a propositional function.
Can you quickly walk through the author of Waverley example? How does that analysis work?
Okay, so when you say Scott was the author of Waverley, the phrase the author of Waverley isn't treated as a single unit referring to Scott. Instead, the whole proposition gets analyzed into something like this. There exists at least one person, let's call them X, such that X wrote Waverley, and D for any other person Y. If Y wrote Waverley, then Y is the same person as X. So at most, one person wrote it. And D, that unique person X, is identical with Scott. See how Scott himself isn't part of the meaning derived from the description? The description is analyzed into claims about existence and uniqueness using a variable, X. This lets us talk meaningfully about things defined by description, the tallest mountain, without assuming we're acquainted with them or smuggling in mysterious entities. It keeps the logic clean.
Wow. Okay, so this whole journey through logic, science, and the critique of intuition, it leads to a pretty stark view of our place in the universe, doesn't it? The scientific philosophy paints a picture of a world that's fundamentally purposeless, more void of meaning, where we're just accidental byproducts of blind causes heading towards extinction in the vast death of the solar system. And the only honest place to build our lives, our soul's habitation, is on this firm foundation of unyielding despair. That's bleak.
It sounds bleak, but the argument is that facing this reality squarely is actually the starting point for true human dignity, not the end of it. If the universe is this vast, blind, omnipotent machine without purpose, our unique advantage is that we have sight. We have knowledge of good and evil. Our freedom, our superiority, lies precisely in our ability to examine, to criticize, and crucially, in our imagination, to create ideals.
So the core ethical takeaway isn't despair, but resistance. A refusal to worship the brute force of reality.
Exactly. A refusal to worship naked power, whether it's the indifference of nature or human systems based on force like militarism. If the world of facts revealed by science isn't inherently good, then our job is to cherish the ideals, truth, beauty, perfection that life itself often denies us. And achieving this involves a kind of double submission, interestingly. Religion often teaches submission in our actions. Science teaches submission in our thoughts. Submission to fact. Real wisdom, then, requires submitting our desires, accepting what the universe is going to do anyway, resignation. But it demands absolute freedom for our thoughts. And it's that freedom of thought, untainted by hope or fear, that gives rise to art and philosophy.
It definitely takes immense courage, though. To really follow this path means letting go of some deeply ingrained, comfortable beliefs, killing the ego, slaying that relentless desire for personal satisfaction.
It does. And the ultimate liberation, the sources suggest, comes from contemplating fate itself. Not fighting it, but understanding it. To take those huge indifferent forces, death, change, our own powerlessness against the universe's blind machinery right into the inmost shrine of the soul, to know them as objective realities. That's how you conquer them psychologically. The free man's worship, then, isn't about seeking personal happiness anymore. It's about letting go of that temporary striving and instead burning with passion for eternal things, for truth, for beauty, for the shared human condition. And in doing so, shedding a kind of compassionate sunshine on the common doom we all face together.